For 40 nights the palace was silent except for the sound of footsteps, the slow, frantic pacing of an emperor who refused to sleep. Servants whispered that he looked like a ghost wrapped in silk. Physicians begged him to rest. Priests warned him the mind cannot fight the dark forever. But the emperor only trembled and whispered the same words, "If I sleep, something will take me." The night the emperor stopped sleeping, the palace lamps had burned so low they looked like dying stars scattered across marble floors. Midnight was passing into something darker, that hour when silence becomes oppressive, when even the air seems to hold its breath. And in the vast imperial residence built to honour gods and terrify mortals, one sound echoed again and again. Footsteps, uneven, erratic, dragging, then quickening, then stopping entirely as if the walker feared the next step might awaken something ancient beneath the stone. Those footsteps belonged to the emperor. He had not slept in 3 nights. At first, the court thought it was grief. Rulers often carried sorrow like a hidden chain. Then they thought it was devotion. Long vigils were common among holy kings. But on the 4th night, when the emperor's physicians found him seated upright with blood seeping from the corners of his eyes, they understood. This was not devotion. This was terror. Pure, unfiltered terror. He whispered to them through cracked lips, staring into the dark as though something stared back. "If I close my eyes, it will take me." When they asked what, he never answered. His gaze only drifted toward the far end of the chamber, where the shadows seemed too thick, too watchful, too alive. By the 7th night, even the guards refused to stand alone near his door. They spoke of seeing him pace silently, hands shaking, head jerking toward invisible movements in the corners. They swore they heard him muttering to shadows, bargaining with them, pleading with them. By the 10th night, the empire whispered that their ruler was cursed. By the 20th, they whispered he was dying. But the truth the emperor himself confessed in a voice that didn't sound like his own, was far worse. He believed death was stalking him, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally, as a presence that sat beside him, followed him, breathed against his neck, waiting for one moment of weakness. And sleep was weakness. As days blurred into nights, the emperor's mind began to warp under the weight of exhaustion. He started seeing figures where no human stood. He felt cold fingers brush his spine. He smelled earth, fresh, damp, grave earth, whenever he dared to blink. Servants found him clawing at his own eyelids to keep them open. Priests heard him confess sins he had never committed simply to keep his mouth moving, because silence made the present stronger. And the court watched as the most powerful man in the empire, a man believed to be chosen by God, unravelled thread by thread, but to understand why he feared sleep so violently, why he believed death had singled him out, why the most sacred crown in the realm felt like it was crushing his skull. We must return to the night everything began, the night the emperor dreamed of his own funeral. It happened 40 days before his collapse, the dream that would become prophecy, obsession, and torment. A dream so vivid, so real, so saturated with the scent of incense and rotting lilies that he swore his soul had wandered into the afterlife and been denied re-entry. What he saw in that dream would transform a ruler into a prisoner, a man into a myth, a throne into a tomb he feared to fall asleep inside. Tonight we step into the darkness that claimed him, the dream that broke an empire. Before the sleepless nights, before the trembling hands, before the flicker of terror in his eyes became permanent, the emperor had been a man of extraordinary discipline, a man raised to believe that God had sculpted him for a singular purpose, to rule, to protect, to endure. His childhood was a mosaic of rituals, dawn prayers, lessons in divine law, hours spent reciting genealogies until he could name every ancestor back to the mythic founder, who, according to legend, had descended from heaven wrapped in armour of light. The empire did not simply expect greatness from him, it demanded divinity. From the moment he could speak, he was told, "Your blood is sacred, Your breath is a blessing. Your dreams are visions sent from above. But children raised to be symbols rarely learn how to be human. And when humanity cracks beneath divine expectation, the breaking is not gentle. On the night that would reshape his fate, the emperor, then still young, still strong, still beloved, lay down in his chamber at twilight. He had returned from a victorious campaign, greeted by roaring crowds. His counsellors praised him, his generals bowed, his people believed the heavens themselves had restored their protector. He felt invincible. Then the dream began, not with sound, not with images, but with cold, an invasive, unnatural cold that seeped into his bones. The torches in his bedroom extinguished one by one, though he was not awake enough to notice. What he saw instead was a hall lit by hundreds of candles, their flames bending as if blown by breath he could not feel. He recognized the place instantly. The imperial mausoleum. He was lying on a stone slab, wrapped in embroidered burial cloth, hands folded over his chest. He tried to move. He couldn't. Then he heard crying. Soft at first. A woman's voice. His mother. She stood at the foot of the slab, veiled in mourning silk, whispering prayers for his soul. He opened his mouth to speak, and nothing came out. Not breath, not sound, not life. Panic surged through him. In the dream he tried to rise. His muscles refused. He tried to shout. Silence. He felt weight on his chest. Not cloth, not armour, but hands. Invisible, heavy, deliberate. He looked down. 2 pale fingers curled over the burial shroud, then a second hand, then the suggestion of a face, blurred like smoke, pressing against the fabric. Death itself, leaning over him, not a figure, not a skeleton, not an angel, but a presence, a consciousness older than kingdoms, a hunger older than time. And it whispered, not in words, but in a sensation, a vibration that ran along his spine. If you sleep, I will return. He jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his pulse hammering so violently he thought his heart would rupture. The chamber was exactly as he left it. No cold, no shadowy presence. But in the corner stood his mother, the real one, weeping quietly. She claimed she had come because she had felt something dark pass through the palace. A mother's intuition, a shiver of foreboding. But the emperor saw the dream's echo in her eyes. And then she said the words that sealed his fate. My son, you were not breathing when I entered. From that night on, sleep became an enemy. Rest became a threat. The dream became prophecy. Every time he blinked, he feared he would return to that stone slab, feel those hands pressing down, hear that silent whisper from the thing that waited for him. Close your eyes, and you are mine. Fear grew roots inside him. And fear, when watered by divine expectation, does not stay small. It becomes empire-shaking terror. Soon he stopped sleeping altogether, not because he wanted to, but because he believed sleep was death in disguise. In the weeks that followed, the emperor's fear would metastasize into visions, paranoia, spiritual hallucinations, and a psychological collapse so catastrophic it nearly destroyed the throne itself. But to understand how that collapse unfolded, we must return to the world he ruled. A world that demanded perfection, worshipped power, and taught its rulers that death was the only enemy they were never allowed to lose to. The empire that made him a god. If the emperor had lived as a farmer, a monk, or a merchant, the dream might have been dismissed as a fever of the mind, a trick of exhaustion, a shadow passing through the subconscious. But he was not a man, not in the eyes of his people. He was a living relic, anointed with oil, crowned beneath heaven's light, raised from infancy to believe that the divine moved through his veins like blood, and the empire had been built to reinforce that illusion at every breath. The palace where he walked in terror was not a home. It was a monument, carved in cold stone to erase any trace of human weakness. Every hallway was lined with the portraits of previous emperors, each staring down with immortal serenity, each painted larger than life. Their eyes followed him wherever he went. Do not disappoint us, they seemed to say. Do not fail the crown. Do not fail God. But behind the reverence lay rot. Court astrologers charted his every decision by the movement of stars, claiming fate whispered through constellations. The high priests paraded him through temples, forcing children to kneel and kiss his robes. Even his private tutors spoke to him the way one speaks to a celestial being, as though a wrong syllable might shatter the balance of the universe. This illusion of divinity had been built brick by brick since his cradle, and now, as insomnia hollowed out his mind, that illusion became a prison. Because how can a god admit fear? How can a god confess that he trembles in the dark? How can a god admit he dreamed his own death? He couldn't, so he hid it. He walked among his court by day, still wrapped in gold-threaded robes that clung to his skeletal frame. His face was powdered to hide the purple hollows beneath his eyes. His crown was positioned just so, angled to conceal the way his head sometimes drooped from exhaustion, but the cracks were spreading. By the 15th night without sleep, he began to lose his sense of time. Hours bled into each other like ink on water. He mistook dusk for dawn. He repeated instructions he had already given. He sometimes forgot he was speaking at all. A chronicler wrote, "The emperor's eyes no longer followed men, they hunted shadows." Still, the court pretended nothing was wrong. Why? Because a tired emperor was a weak emperor, and a weak emperor could be controlled. His advisers began slipping decrees under his trembling hand, guiding his signature like a tutor guiding a child's. His generals began making decisions in his name. His treasurer quietly siphoned funds for his own gain, knowing the emperor was too delirious to notice. Every sleepless hour weakened him. Every weakened hour empowered them. Fear made him fragile. But the court's ambition weaponized his fragility. And yet the emperor's terror did not come from politics. It came from a presence only he could feel. It began appearing in mirrors, in the shimmer of the polished floors, in the ink pool at the edge of his writing table, a flicker, a silhouette, just behind him. At first he turned around and saw emptiness, but on the 18th night he didn't. He saw a shape, tall, indistinct, human only in outline, standing beside the window, not breathing, not moving, waiting. The emperor froze. His breath caught in his throat. The room was so silent he could hear his own heartbeat stuttering like a broken drum. The figure did nothing. It didn't lunge. It didn't whisper. It only watched. And then, as he blinked, it was gone. He collapsed to his knees, shaking so violently the guards outside rushed in. When they found him, he was whispering the same phrase over and over, like a child reciting a prayer he barely understood. "It knows I'm awake." Rumours spread, too quickly for the ministers to contain. Some said he was haunted. Others said he was cursed for pride. A few whispered that he had begun to see the angels who escorted kings to their graves. But the emperor knew the truth. It was not an angel. It was not a vision. It was the same thing that had stood over him in the mausoleum of his dream, and it would not leave until he slept. The empire had made him believe he was divine. Now that lie was consuming him, and as the sleepless nights stretched toward the 40th day, something inside his mind began to crack, not gently, but with a violence that would soon shake the throne. The 40 nights of descent. By the 20th night, the emperor no longer walked. He drifted. His feet moved, but his mind floated somewhere behind his body, tethered only by threads of fear. Servants whispered that he left a chill behind him, as though the warmth of life no longer clung to his skin. But it was the eyes that frightened them most. Once bright, steady, and commanding, they now twitched toward every corner of the room, scanning the shadows with the desperation of a hunted animal. The iris had dulled to a clouded grey, ringed by capillaries that burst anew each evening, creating a halo of crimson. He looked less like a sovereign, and more like a man being devoured from within. By the 25th night, hallucinations became his only companions. He heard footsteps behind him, soft, measured, deliberate. He spun around, nothing. He heard breathing over his shoulder, slow, hungry, patient. He whipped his head around, only empty air. He began to dread the moments when the palace grew silent, because in silence the presence grew louder. On the 28th night, he confided in the only person he still trusted, his mother, the woman who had once soothed him through childhood terrors. She sat beside him in the dim chamber, her fingers wrapped around his trembling hands. "Tell me what hunts you," she whispered, and he answered in a voice that did not sound like his own. "It has no face, it has no voice, it waits." She asked what it wanted. His eyes widened with childlike terror. "Me." She tried to reassure him, to promise protection, prayer, warmth, the memory of lullabies. But he recoiled violently from her touch, certain that attachment made him vulnerable, that emotional closeness created openings for whatever stalked him in the dark. Fear had become his god now, and he worshipped it faithfully. On the 30th night the emperor collapsed, not from weakness, but from a sudden, paralyzing vision. He stood in the grand throne room, the place where he had been declared chosen by heaven before thousands. But in the vision, no one else was there, no courtiers, no banners, no light, just the throne, and the presence sitting on it, tall, shadowed, motionless. It lifted one finger, slowly, and beckoned him forward. He tried to scream, but the sound drowned in his throat. When the vision shattered, he found himself on the floor, fingers clawing the marble tiles, tears soaking the hem of his robe. The guards found him and lifted him to his feet, but the emperor shoved them away, shaking. "I cannot enter that room again," he stammered. "If I do, I will not leave alive." The court panicked. The throne cannot rule itself. A monarch afraid of his own dominion was not merely a sick man. He was a threat to the stability of the realm. Whispers turned into strategies. Strategies turned into plans. Plans turned into opportunities. A sleepless emperor was easy to manipulate. A terrified emperor was even easier. But by the 35th night, politics no longer mattered, because the emperor's mind had begun to detach from reality entirely. He started responding to voices no one else heard. He flinched at shadows that did not exist. He avoided sleep with a desperation that bordered on violent hysteria, clawing at his own arms, pacing until his legs buckled, whispering prayers under his breath so quickly they became incoherent. Then came the night the palace woke to screams. Not his, but the servants'. Torches were lit, guards yelled orders, priests rushed toward the noise, and there, in the centre of his chamber, they found him, standing on the edge of the balcony railing, barefoot, swaying above a dark, fatal drop. When they begged him to step down, the emperor's gaze was vacant, lips trembling, skin slick with sweat. "If I don't stay awake," he whispered, "it will drag me from this world." The guards pulled him back with force, and he fought, wild, trembling, frantic, until exhaustion folded him to the floor. By the 38th night, his body had begun to fail. His heart skipped beats. His hands shook uncontrollably. He vomited water. He could barely stand. And still, he did not sleep. Every blink felt like death's hand brushing his cheek. Every tremor felt like the beginning of the end. Every breath tasted like soil. Then, on the 40th night, something happened that no one in the palace ever forgot. As the candles burned low and the emperor sat on the floor, rocking slowly as if cradling his own fear, the presence finally stepped out of the dark. He didn't see a vision. He didn't imagine a shape. He saw it, with the clarity of a man staring into the eyes of his executioner. It leaned toward him, featureless yet intimate, like a lover arriving at last. And it whispered, not in echo, not in dream, but in unmistakable words. "Sleep." The emperor screamed, a sound so raw it cut through the palace like a blade. And that is the moment his mind broke, forever. When the mind shatters, power feeds. When they found him after the scream that tore through the palace like fabric ripping under a violent hand, the emperor was curled in the corner of his chamber. His robes were soaked in sweat, his fingernails torn and bleeding from clawing at the stone, his pupils blown wide like a man dragged back from the edge of death. He did not recognize the guards who lifted him. He did not recognize the priests who knelt beside him. He did not even recognize his own mother. He whispered one sentence over and over, a mantra of terror, a confession from the ruins of his mind. It touched me. Every court physician was summoned. Every monk who claimed to know a charm against evil was brought in. Every advisor gathered in panic, arguing whether they were witnessing madness, possession, or the wrath of God. But none of them understood the truth. The emperor had not collapsed into insanity. He had crossed a threshold. 40 nights without sleep breaks the boundaries between imagination and hallucination, memory and nightmare, reality and whatever waits beyond the final flicker of consciousness. Psychology calls it catastrophic sleep deprivation. Mysticism calls it the shattering of the veil. Philosophy calls it the collapse of the Apollonian order, the moment when the rational self dissolves and the primal darkness within us steps forward. The emperor simply called it death. But while his soul unravelled, the court began to stitch something else, something cold and deliberate, around his crumbling sanity. Opportunity. His ministers arrived one by one, kneeling with rehearsed grief. But behind the tears was hunger. Behind the prayers was calculation. A king who cannot sleep is a king who cannot think. A king who sees shadows is a king who will sign anything placed before him. And so, the feeding began. The regent. His cousin, the one who had always envied his crown, entered his chambers draped in mourning colours, feigning concern. "Sire," he whispered, "allow me to manage affairs until you recover." The emperor shook his head frantically. "I cannot sleep. I cannot rest. If I rest—" "Yes, yes," the cousin murmured soothingly. "We know. Let me carry the burden." That night he wrote decrees in the emperor's name, granting himself military power, the high priest. The head of the church arrived next. He sprinkled holy water on the emperor's brow, muttered solemn blessings, and declared before the council that God was testing their monarch's soul. But when he left the chamber, he issued a proclamation stripping the emperor of the right to appoint religious leaders. The treasurer, the man entrusted with the empire's wealth, visited as well. He sat beside the emperor, nodding gently as the ruler babbled about shadows and whispers. "Sire," he said softly, "sign this. Funds for the temple, funds for your protection." But the decree he slid under the emperor's shaking hand funneled the empire's gold into his own pockets. And so the court devoured the emperor's authority with polite smiles and trembling voices, pretending sympathy while carving the empire into pieces, like vultures circling a dying god. Yet through the political chaos, one figure remained steady: his mother. Where the rest of the court saw opportunity, she saw tragedy. A child, not an emperor, drowning in fear. She alone tended to him in the long, trembling hours of night. She washed his face. She pressed cool cloths to his feverish skin. She whispered the stories she used to tell him as a boy when storms shattered the sky. But the emperor flinched even from her touch now, because in his shattered mind, tenderness meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant sleep, and sleep meant surrendering to the thing waiting in the dark. He begged her, "Don't let me close my eyes." And she, refusing to let him die in terror, ordered servants to keep lamps burning in every room. She forced the court physicians to stay awake in shifts, brewing bitter teas to keep him conscious. She even ordered the palace musicians to play through the night to drown out the whispers he claimed to hear. But by the 41st day, nothing worked anymore. His body wasn't simply tired, it was failing, shutting down organ by organ. His thoughts came in shattered fragments. He forgot words, he forgot faces. At times he forgot what it meant to be alive, touching the marble floor as if it were an unfamiliar surface. The last thread of sanity snapped at dusk on that 41st evening. A servant lighting the lamps dropped a candle. The flame flickered. The Emperor gasped and collapsed as if struck. He screamed, "It's here!" And when the guards pulled him back, he wasn't screaming at the shadows. He was screaming at something standing behind them. But the guards saw nothing. Nothing at all. And the Emperor laughed, a broken, cracked sound, because he understood then that he was entirely alone. No one else could see the thing hunting him. No one else could save him. He whispered, barely audible, "It will take me tonight." His mother knelt beside him, gripping his hands, forcing her voice to stay steady. "No, I will not let you die." But the Emperor's eyes drifted over her shoulder, toward the darkness gathering in the corner of the room, and for the first time he did not tremble. He simply said, "It's already here. The night." The Empire held its breath. By the time the sun bled into the horizon, staining the palace walls with the colour of dying embers, every person within its marble heart felt it. A pressure, thick and suffocating, as though the air itself waited for something to happen. The Emperor lay on a silk mattress he no longer recognised, surrounded by priests clutching relics, physicians whispering frantic theories, and guards who stood frozen because even the slightest sound seemed sacrilegious. The chamber felt both too large and impossibly small, a cathedral and a coffin at once. His mother knelt beside him, fingers laced through his trembling hands. "Stay with me," she whispered. "It's only exhaustion, only fear." But the Emperor did not answer. He stared upward, unblinking, pupils blown wide, tracking something moving across the ceiling that no one else could see. The priests murmured psalms, the guards tightened their grips on their weapons, the physicians prepared sedatives they no longer believed would work. And then the Emperor spoke, in a voice scraped raw. "Don't let the lamps go out." The command shattered the tense silence. Servants rushed to refill the oil. Torches were checked and rechecked. Flame after flame flickered to life until the room glowed with frantic light. Shadows retreated into the corners, but the Emperor's gaze did not leave the ceiling. His mother followed his trembling stare and saw nothing. Nothing except plaster, gold leaf, painted angels. Yet the Emperor whispered, "It's climbing. Closer." A priest moved to bless him, but the Emperor flinched violently, clutching the sheets. "No prayers," he hissed. "Prayers make it stronger." That was the moment everyone in the room understood. They were no longer speaking to a ruler. They were speaking to a man whose mind had been dragged to the very edge of something primordial. A fear older than scripture, older than empires. A fear of being watched by the void. The court silence. Outside his chamber, the palace had become a ghost. Courtiers walked on tiptoe, terrified that even a single echo might worsen the Emperor's condition. Ministers argued in hoarse whispers over succession. Servants wept silently in the kitchens. The captain of the guard forbade any laughter, claiming it might offend the thing haunting his majesty. Superstition grew like mould. Some said the Emperor was being punished for pride. Some said a demon had followed him from the battlefield. Some claimed the dream had been a prophecy of the Empire's fall. None of them were wrong. The last moments of sanity. Inside the chamber, the Emperor began speaking to someone who wasn't there. At first it was soft, gentle, as if pleading. "No, not yet. Please." Then it became angry. "You can't take me. I am chosen. Chosen." Then terrified again. "I'm not ready. I'm not. Please." His mother tried to soothe him, but he recoiled as though her touch burned. The Emperor pressed himself against the headboard, eyes fixed on the darkened corner of the room. The one spot the torchlight never seemed to reach, no matter how many flames were brought in. That was when he said, "It's standing right there." Several guards looked instinctively. They saw nothing. The Emperor began to sob, not with hysteria, but with the resigned agony of a man finally seeing his own fate. "You don't understand," he whispered. It's been waiting 40 nights for me." His mother clutched him. "There is nothing here," but he shook his head slowly. "There's never nothing. There's only what most eyes cannot bear to see. The sleep that could not be stopped. Human bodies break before human minds do. Even a king cannot outrun biology." By the 42nd night, the Emperor's limbs twitched involuntarily. His speech slurred. His heart stuttered in painful, uneven beats. And then, as the palace held its breath, he did the one thing he had fought against with every breath in his body. He blinked. A long, heavy, weighted blink. His eyes opened halfway, unfocused, then again, longer, then again, heavier. His mother squeezed his hands desperately. "Sire, stay with me. Stay." But the Emperor's head slumped forward. His eyelids fluttered. And finally, they closed. The room fell silent. Utterly silent. A priest dropped to his knees. A guard muttered a curse. A physician reached for the Emperor's wrist with shaking fingers, then froze. Because at that exact moment, the moment his eyes fully shut for the first time in 42 nights, the torches flickered. Every single flame in the chamber bent sharply sideways, as though something unseen had passed through. Something cold, something purposeful, something that had been waiting. A wind that should not exist in a sealed chamber swept across the Emperor's body. His mother screamed. The guards lunged forward, but it was too late. The presence he had feared, whether born from madness, exhaustion, divinity, or some unknown frontier of the human psyche, had claimed its moment. And when the Emperor finally exhaled, it sounded like a sigh of relief, or surrender. The Emperor who awoke in the dark. There are moments in history so quiet they feel unreal. Moments when time pauses, when the world holds its breath, when the boundary between life and death thins to a single trembling thread. This was one of those moments. The Emperor lay still, eyes closed for the first time in 42 nights. His mother knelt beside him, tears streaking down her cheeks, whispering his childhood name, not his title. Priests hovered with relics pressed to their chests. Physicians hovered with trembling fingers, unsure whether to check for life or to brace for death. Outside the chamber, the palace dared not move. Ministers, guards, servants, all frozen in a silence so deep it swallowed even thought. And then, the Emperor inhaled, a faint, shallow breath, barely more than a tremor in the air. His mother gasped, hope igniting too quickly. But hope, in a palace like this, is a dangerous illusion. The Emperor's eyelids fluttered once, twice, then opened, slowly, not with relief, not with clarity, but with the dull, distant awareness of a man waking in a body that no longer felt entirely his own. His pupils did not contract in the light. They didn't react at all. A physician whispered, "Sire, can you hear us?" The Emperor's gaze drifted toward him, not focused, not present, like the gaze of a newborn discovering the world for the first time, or a dying man seeing it for the last. His lips parted, the room leaned closer, and he whispered, "They saw it." The words were so faint, so fragile, they barely rose above the crackling of the torches. His mother clutched his face between her palms. "What did you see?" she begged. "A dream? A vision? Tell me." But he didn't answer her. He wasn't looking at her anymore. His gaze had slipped past her, toward the darkest corner of the chamber, the spot no flame had ever truly illuminated. His breathing quickened. His chest began to rise and fall in shallow bursts. He lifted a trembling finger, pointed toward the shadow, and whispered. It followed me back. Panic surged through the room. A priest dropped his relic. A guard reached instinctively for his sword. His mother pulled him into her arms, desperate to shield him from whatever horror he believed had returned. But the Emperor stiffened, body rigid, eyes wide, lips trembling. "Mother," he rasped, "it doesn't need my sleep anymore." A chill swept through the chamber. Not merely physical, but emotional, psychological, spiritual. A realization. Whatever he feared, whatever he had fled for 40 nights, Whatever presence stalked him through hallucination, exhaustion, dream, or delirium, he believed it no longer lived in the dark. He believed it now lived in him. The aftermath. A crown of ruins. In the days that followed, the emperor drifted between lucidity and madness like a man walking on a fractured bridge. He would speak clearly one moment, recognizing his counsel, discussing law, apologizing to his mother for frightening her. And the next, he would recoil from unseen shadows, mutter prayers to protect his soul, or stare blankly at walls as though something whispered through them. His court chroniclers wrote only what was sanctioned. His ministers wrote only what served them. His priests wrote only what reinforced doctrine. But the servants, the ones who saw him at dawn and dusk, in sickness and silence, left the truest record. The emperor woke each morning as though returning from death. He spoke to presences no one else saw. He feared sleep even after sleep claimed him. He never again walked into a darkened room. Power returned to the ministers. Authority returned to the regency. But the emperor, he was never whole again. Even when he smiled in public, his mother saw the tremor in his jaw. Even when he addressed the Senate, his priests saw his eyes flick toward empty corners. Even when he held his newborn heir, the nurses swore his body shook with a fear he could not name. It wasn't death that had marked him. It was terror, the kind that leaves fingerprints on the soul. The last night, years later, when his health finally collapsed for good, the emperor asked to be left alone in his chambers. No guards, no priests, no scribes, only his mother beside him. He took her hand weakly. "Mother," he whispered, "I am so tired." "You may rest now," she said gently. "You are safe." He closed his eyes, but not in fear this time, and for the first time since his youth he slept peacefully. When he breathed his final breath, the torches did not flicker. There was no cold wind, no presence in the shadows, only silence, the kind that sounds like release. They buried him in the imperial mausoleum, the same place he had seen in the dream that shattered his mind. But his legend did not die there. Some said he had glimpsed the truth of mortality before any human should. Some said he had gone too close to the boundary between life and the unknown. Some said the presence he feared had been nothing more than the fragmented echo of a divine pressure no mortal mind could withstand. And some whispered, quietly, reverently, fearfully, that sleep is not a refuge. Sleep is a threshold, a thin, fragile veil between the world we know and the one waiting just beyond the closing of our eyes. The emperor spent 40 nights standing on that threshold, and when he finally crossed it, he did so with the dignity of a man who had faced his deepest terror and realized that even a crown cannot protect the human mind from itself. In the end, the throne survived. The empire survived. But the man beneath the crown had already been taken long before his body died. Not by death, not by madness, but by the simple, devastating truth. No one, not even an empress, can outrun the darkness that lives inside the mind.